Welcome to Strength Chat Podcast, presented by Kabuki Strength. Introducing your hosts, Chris Duffin, the mad scientist of strength, Rudy Cadlove, mature athlete and coach, and the wizard of training himself, Brandon Sen.
Welcome, Strength Chat listeners, to today's podcast. Today we host Eric Helms, dual sport athlete and coach from 3D Muscle Journey. We're going to take a deep dive into autoregulation today, probably deeper than we've ever gone. We get Eric's thoughts on the pitfalls and misunderstandings of autoregulation, who and how it should be used, autoregulation on load, autoregulation on exercise selection, autoregulation on volume. We'll discuss the importance of not only the physiological changes, but the psychological effects of programming and how autoregulation fits into a training plan. So sit back and enjoy Eric Helms on Strength Chat.
Welcome to Strength Chat with your host. That's right, the mad scientist of strength, myself, Chris Duffin. To my right, our mature athlete and coach, Dr. Rudolph, is over here playing with some papers. I don't know what he is doing.
I'm getting ready to take notes.
Oh, okay.
Yeah, here we go.
Better take some notes.
I'm going to take notes.
And to my left, the wizard of training, Mr. Brandon Sen. Hey, Brandon, speaking of being the wizard of training, it seems that some of your clients over the last couple of weeks have performed quite well, if I'm not mistaken.
They've been killing it, knocking it out of the park, yeah.
Most recently, just yesterday or Saturday, Eva Dunbar set the highest Wilks
of all time. Regardless of male or female, regardless of class. There might be a couple of multiply guys that are higher, but
we're not counting gear lifting, but that's
her Wilks was 637, which, to put that in perspective, I think Zahir's was like 633. Yuri's is like 627, and so Eric Lillybridge is right below that too. So she beat out some pretty top names. I think she's the only. There might be. I'm looking at the list right now. I think there might be one or two other females in the top 10 list, but absolutely insane.
So she's the highest Wilks of any human being ever.
By Wilks, she's the best powerlifter of all time.
That's pretty cool.
Yeah, it is. That is. What were her lifts? She lifted in the 148-pound class, right?
148. I think she totaled 1370. I think I don't know the lifts off the top of my head. I'd have to go back and look at the email, but it was somewhere around like a 512 deadlift, 535 squat, and then whatever the bench was.
Yeah, 315.
She took the all-time squat and the all-time bench record, and then just took whatever she needed on the deadlift. So absolutely freaking insane. And she's also a professional bodybuilder. So she's one of our few dual sport athletes. This last year, she got her pro card. She's hoping to finish out her powerlifting season, and we'll be transitioning her back to bodybuilding, which honestly, that is even more impressive to me that we were able to maintain almost all of her strength through her last bodybuilding prep because we handled her during that too.
How long have you been training her?
We've been working with Ava since like 2015. So she's one of our OG lifters.
Yeah. And then same Saturday, one of your teenage clients. I always remember
the GMO.
Yeah, the GMO. How old is Cole?
Cole's 17, and he squatted 700
in sleeves. Yeah,
buried it. He benched 440, which was like a 20-pound meat PR, and then he pulled like 650 or 635,
which was off for him on the deadlift.
Yeah, so he totaled. I think he totaled somewhere in the neighborhood of 1760, and just crushed it too. He's going to be looking to do hopefully the U.S. Open next year, which we'll try and get him into that. And then
the thing is, I mean, I talked to Cole before the meet, and he didn't have like big goals going into this because you've been helping him with getting out of pain and some other stuff. And actually, he said his squat was pain free. It was 700.
He smoked it too. If you go back because he squatted 700 in our meet here, which is the time that we started working with him. And this 700 in this last meet was like a second attempt.
It was smoked.
Yeah. So I'm super excited. He wants to get into wraps this year too, so that'll be kind of nutty to see what he can do.
I just can't imagine being like in the same school as him with that 17-year-old monster.
He played football. Can you imagine him as like a fullback?
The entire opposing line, like.
Yeah, And then Anthony Habaika,
Yep.
Ava's husband, totaled 1920, which was just outside of the number one all-time world record as a 181. So big shout out to him. He's going to be coming back for that. Hopefully, I don't know. I got a call scheduled with both of them tonight. I think they have updated their yearly training plans to look at the possibly the U.S. Open this year. So that'd be a lot of fun.
Excellent. Well, both you and I are going to.
Yeah. Well, we'd then have we'd have Joe Sullivan there. We'd have Chris Bridgeford, Ava, and Anthony. So we'd have a really solid spread. I'm super excited for them.
Yeah, congratulations, Brandon.
They're awesome.
That's
They're
great.
freaking animals.
Super job.
But speaking of dual sport athletes, or even dual sport coaches,
Bodybuilder, powerlifter,
powerlifter, all that good stuff. We've got Eric Helms on the show today, so really excited for a discussion with Eric. So Eric has been. I'll keep the intro pretty short because he's been around the industry for almost 2 decades now. I'm exaggerating by a couple years, but he's been he's been in the game as a coach, as an author, and when I say author, I don't mean like blog posting author, but like peer reviewed research on a regular basis. He speaks both academically as well as just other seminars in regards to exercise science and nutrition, and he's active as well. He is both a natural pro bodybuilder as well as competing in the IPF as well. So welcome to the show, Eric.
Thank you for having me, and thank you for the jab at how old I am. I appreciate that. For the record, 2 decades ago, I was in high school. So I put that out there.
I'm just going. There is, in some bio somewhere, you stretches said the industry since 2000. So it's 2018. It's almost
stretch that out. First personal training job. First time you lift a barbell.
I know. I could stretch it out.
Yeah, that was like when I was in the Air Force leading like conditioning classes.
Yeah, exactly. So.
Fair enough. Yeah.
Well, how about this? Very active in your current roles for what, about the last decade or so? So,
yeah, I would say that decades. Yeah, that's pretty accurate. So, yeah, I'll take that.
Did you shave your legs?
No, I didn't.
Yes, you did.
What are you doing?
I just felt your calf, and there's no hair.
There is no hair.
You just shaved your legs.
He's never had hair in his
never had
calves.
hair on my calves.
We'll see.
They're
You-
so
you see
massive.
the quads.
They're so
His
massive.
pants rub the hair off.
They rub the hair off.
I don't think so.
I see that you're just trying to bridge the gap when you have a bodybuilder on your show. You're just trying to make me feel welcome. And I
He
appreciate
shaved
it.
one of his calves.
It's
Rolled the
just,
pant leg
it's
up.
all right. We're doing a podcast, and Brandon is over here touching my legs.
Well, you rolled it up.
So
Nice.
There's
Trying
no
to
hair
help you
there.
relax.
It's hard to miss it.
it's a good thing this is not a video cast today. Okay. What is Brandon doing over there, petting Duffin's leg? I don't understand.
I'm just hanging out. I'm just
Okay.
observing.
So, Eric, we love talking about autoregulation. We talk about it quite a bit on our show, and we do a lot of it with our athletes. We were kind of talking about some of our athletes and on the intro, and have seen significant success with it. You basically have a doctorate on the subject. Is that not correct?
Yeah, that's close to accurate. I specifically did my PhD on autoregulation training for powerlifters. So I was fortunate enough to contact Mike Toucher, who's probably pretty well known in this space, at least in the RPE side of it.
Yep.
Back in, I want to say late 2013, and said, "Hey man, I'm thinking about doing a PhD. How would you feel about me investigating some of the concept you developed in RTS?" And like the true badass he is, he was like, "Definitely. And if it doesn't come out well, still publish that. I'm all about learning." So got the blessing from the man himself, and decided to go forward with it. And that's what I've been doing since early 2014. I just actually completed and defended my doctorate in late last year. So I'm a fresh, starry-eyed new doctor. So,
All right. Well, congratulations.
Thank you.
Let's just jump into since we spent quite a bit of time talking about it, but some more specific questions around implementation. And some of the things I wonder is, especially your experience coaching a lot of other athletes. We have our own views here, but who do you see autoregulation principles working well for, and who do you see them not working well for? And what kind of common pitfalls do you see, not necessarily like in your implementation, but like when we look across the broad spectrum of people that have some knowledge of it and maybe aren't applying it properly, those sorts of things. So what are some common pitfalls as well?
Yeah, great question. I think the most common pitfall
That's
is
actually
just not
three
really...
questions. I'm writing them down, but it's all.
Thank you. Yeah.
That's why he's got the notepad.
Yeah, great essay. Yeah, so I would say probably the biggest pitfall is a misunderstanding of what autoregulation is at its core. And to me, the rationale behind why people might want to use autoregulation is the same as just good coaching. The difference is whether or not you have a coach with you when you're in the gym, or whether you're kind of riding solo and getting someone to program for you, or you're doing, online coaching where you see them once a week, or maybe you have a strength coach you meet with once a week, but you have to train on your own multiple times. So, obviously, if you are, in a sports facility and every time you step in the weight room, you have an S&C or an assistant S&C's eyes on you, you might not need to do quote unquote autoregulation because they're going to look at you and go, you know what, you're not looking good today. I want to go down and load. I want to go up and load. Man, this is supposed to be a deload week, but you look fantastic and very fresh. Let's actually put the volume back up, etc. And I think most coaches would acknowledge that that's just called good coaching. That's not anything magic. There's no buzzword attached to that. Autoregulation is useful, especially in 2018 now where, I've coached powerlifters of all levels, bodybuilders of all levels, yet I get a couple videos per week, them checking in, letting me know how the week went, a spreadsheet, and pictures to work with. So I can't be there and do that with them on a day-to-day basis. So it's some way to try to bridge that gap, which I found very useful, to give some tools to the athletes so that they can make those in-game calls. The trick is to figure out at what level of athlete are they able to have that self-awareness and use those tools to their advantage versus to their detriment. And second, when are those tools, or I should say, appropriate in the first place? And there's a whole heap of stuff we could talk about there. But I think the biggest pitfall is people who miscategorize RPE as a specific type of training, or RPE and autoregulation being the same thing. I think some people characterize autoregulation as just instinctive training, just going in there and doing whatever you want based on how you feel. And I think it really shouldn't be that if you want it to be a successful strategy in everyone or most people.
So yeah, it sounds like your views are pretty in line with how we view. I can't say enough about coaching, like that piece that people go, well, this is a new concept. Let's go back. I'm like, what do you think the coach was doing in the room in the 1950s? They were making that call. Their autoregulation was their eyes, right?
Absolutely.
And but in today's environment, a lot of people are just like you. You're coaching people, all around the world, and you've got to have some tools and be able to use it appropriately, or have some sort of transferable program that people can kind of make those judgments with when they don't have that skill basis. So. To do the coaching themselves, to know that feel. So
part two of the questions you asked were, who benefits from autoregulation and who or what type of athlete may not receive as much benefits.
Yeah, and I think that's pretty straightforward to me. The first time you step into the weight room, ideally in a perfect world, you actually have someone's eyes on you and you have some type of mentor. You have some type of fraternity or sorority who's helping you, actually be able to step under the barbell safely and effectively, learn the foundational skills, and then go from there. At that early stage, it's not about, did you take it to failure? It's about, well, did you actually hit the depth without rounding your lumbar? Did you pull with a relatively flat back at initiation? Are you touching your chest on bench without getting crazy internal or external rotation in your shoulder? Like, are you going to break or not? Once you've actually learned how to lift, that's when ensuring that you push things to an appropriate intensity and ensuring that your volume and the stress levels you're ensuring are matching kind of the targets. So I think kind of the first basic principle is that if you're not a well-trained lifter to some degree, autoregulation probably isn't appropriate. Sure, you need self-awareness and you can be tracking, and there are some ways you can use it. But for the most part, and research has borne this out, gauging how far you are from failure, if we're going to talk about RPE or a rating of perceived exertion, in the sense of it gauging how far from failure you are, beginners aren't getting accurate at that. They haven't gone through blocks of training to failure. They haven't been under the bar enough to know what their capabilities are or how and when to push them. An experienced lifter tends to be pretty accurate, and we have a ton of data now showing that strength athletes, bodybuilders, and well-trained lifters who have 4 years under their belt or more are almost bang on the majority of the time with most exercises as well, and guessing how many reps could I do at this load, at least when they're observed by researchers. I know when we're all by ourselves, sometimes ego can get the best of us or fear can get the best of us. But for the most part, in all of the peer-reviewed data, we know that trained lifters are pretty damn good at assessing their own distance from failure. Untrained lifters, not so hot. So I think while there is some use of RPE in gauging distance from failure in beginners, it should primarily be as a learning tool. Like you write down the RPE, but you don't use it to program because it could result in inappropriate loads. But it does create that awareness, and it has them thinking about, what were my capabilities? How far could I have taken that? How far from failure was I? Was I doing appropriately what the coach asked me to do? So I think there are some teaching tools there, but for the most part, this is stuff that should be relegated to the more experienced lifters.
So yeah, I mean, RPE is definitely a skill. Being able to do that is a skill that needs developed, without a doubt. We mentioned, I think Brandon often refers to, a new lifter, everything feels heavy. Everything's an RPE 10. But what other types of autoregulation have you played with besides RPE?
Yeah, I played with a lot, and I think I'm kind of furthering my own anti-cause of making everyone think that autoregulation and RPE are the same thing, and they're not. Autoregulation is basically any tool you use to adjust training on a regular basis based on your readiness or recovery. And there's various forms of it. So having flexible training templates or training configurations is one that I've definitely utilized, where you might have a scheduled hard, easy day, a couple moderate days, and then you base which one you do on how you feel that day. You might have a preset plan, but you might come in and go, what, I feel absolutely wrecked. I don't think, heavy, high volume deadlifts today are a smart idea, or something similar to that. Another way I've utilized that is to have floating off days. So I have more of a checklist of stuff I need to get done by the end of the week, or my athlete needs to get done by the end of the week. And then I can choose when I do my accessory movements and then when I take my off days, so that it can fluctuate not only with my schedule, but also just my perceived recovery on a regular basis. I think key to using that strategy, though, is to have some kind of objective way of assessing your readiness. And, we have various tools, like just coming in and going, I feel like crap. You might be right, but how many times have you felt like crap, gone in and been like, oh shit, I hit a PR? I've definitely experienced that. I know my athletes have. So I think something like maybe your heaviest warm-up, engaging the RPE on it versus what it probably should be. So let's say maybe you're doing a volume day and you're going to do, 5 reps at 75% as your last warm-up before you do, sets at 8 at 77% or something like that. You do that set of 5, and if it's, roughly around a 4 to 6 RPE, okay, you're about normal. That means you should be able to do 10 with it, which is pretty standard. But if you're at a higher RPE than that, maybe that's not going to go very well. Maybe that should turn into, a heavy technique day, like a power day, like singles at 80% or something like that. So I think that's probably a better strategy, is using your last warm-up to gauge kind of where you're at in terms of your strength. And I like to do what Dr. Mike Zerdos calls keeping a power day in the pocket, which is just basically going, right, if I feel surprisingly crappy on any given day, I can come in and just hit a handful of singles at 80% on the big 3 and just call it a useful technique day, but that's really quite low volume, low RPE, allows some recovery, and then I can come back and get back on track.
There's a couple really good strategies there that people should, maybe rewind and listen to again, because I asked about common pitfalls, and I really believe this is a common pitfall of people not understanding autoregulation, is thinking that it's always a pullback tool. Mm-hmm. And there's, again, so many times that your feelings about how you're, walking into the workout are so different than how you perform, and you don't find it out till later. And so I really like that strategy of, really rating that last warm-up set work until you've actually got some weight and load on there. And and that second one for Mike Zordos was nice as well. But People always think that autoregulation, for some reason, if they don't have the, as much knowledge about its use, is that it's something that always tells you to do less. It's a dress day. Take it off. You're not feeling good. And, my experience, our experience has been that if it's used appropriately, you actually end up training more over an entire training block, and you get better results. But you've got to know when and how and just how much more to push it. It's not just going to go wild and put an extra 50 pounds on the bar, but today I've got an extra 5 here. I've got a little bit there, and making those calls right so that you're not, missing lifts and, then needing your rest day. So.
Absolutely. That's been my experience as well. And not to take a shot at anybody, but a lot of the people who criticize autoregulation are more or less just looking for a justification for maintaining what they're currently doing and want to keep doing, which is commendable. They go in there and they crush it every single day, but they're basically always just have their volume turned to 11, and that's all it ever will be. And they're going to go in there and either be frustrated or have a great workout or get hurt. Those are like their 3 options, so that's their DUP is injury, frustration, or great workout, because it's always as hard as possible.
That was me for a long time. That's why we started using Velocity. God, it was quite some time ago. But I'm like, I know I have to have some sort of tool to give me that. I know the right call, and I'm just not making it. And I just need some other data or tool to give me that feedback, because that was me in the early 2000s, without a doubt.
I think most well-intentioned, hardworking lifters start there. They start from a place of passion. They start from a place of valuing hard work. And in the lifting community, typically the biggest badge of honor is not necessarily how much you lift or whether you've got a great physique in whichever circles you run in. It's how hard do you work? Are you willing to get in there and grind? And I think most of us will respect someone even if they are not that great of an athlete objectively. But if they go in there and they do the best they can for them. So I think sometimes, especially in intermediate lifters, they've gotten away from kind of those honeymoon phase gains, and maybe they don't have great genetics or they don't have a great, training system or understanding ahead of them. The one thing they can do is just bust their ass, and which is great. You need that. But at the same time, having a poor training system, not having guidance, and also not understanding that you're just going to be making progress slower, and then trying to bust your ass every workout is a recipe for disaster. And I think a lot of people can look back at their intermediate phase and go, man, I was just getting wrecked all the time. And I think autoregulation for me, or some of the concepts around it that I was exposed to, was a intellectual game changer that allowed me to start training more safely and more optimally in the long run.
So do you use any of those concepts because I know that you work on the physique side as well, not just on the strength side, which I actually value greatly. I think sometimes when we're solely just focused on the strength, sometimes we lose objective of like adding mass, adding size, getting balance, those sorts of things. So I'm running off on a tangent there, but do you utilize some of those principles with athletes in that discipline as well?
Absolutely, yeah. I work with a ton of athletes who are both as well, and have. But yeah, even for pure bodybuilders, there's a role for it, and I think the role becomes more important during contest prep, where essentially the issue is your recovery status is more variable and less predictable, and typically just worse. So there's a role for being able to focus more on, am I working hard enough on this set versus what's the objective load on the bar? Because you might be able to maintain appropriate RPEs throughout a training block. However, the load's going to jump all over the place. That's been my experience, is that you're going to have times where you're actually gaining strength early in contest prep, and then it plateaus, and then it might drop, as your body weight drops. We all know just from looking at weight classes of powerlifting that you can't expect to maintain all your strength when you lose 30 pounds. But being able to focus a little bit less on, oh my God, I've lost my off-season strength, and more on, I am working hard enough. And if that's the new goal, that actually helps to preserve strength, because you don't do silly things or push to failure when you actually don't even have the calories to support it. That on top of having a flexible template is also very useful. And I think other strategies around volume autoregulation can also be, which we haven't talked about yet, can also be pretty useful as well. So yeah, I think they're excellent tools during contest prep when you have a less predictable athlete due to the nutritional variables that you're changing, for sure.
Yeah, I know in a recent talk that you did, you were talking about auto-regulating exercise selection, specifically with physique athletes. Talk to us a little bit about that, because that's something that's not that common in terms of giving like freedom to lifters or physique athletes. So what does auto-regulating exercise selection look like?
Absolutely, yeah. So there was a cool study that just recently came out where they took two bodybuilding splits, and one had like a fixed exercise selection and repetition range on each day. And the other group had the option of one of three exercises on each day on these 3 days per week that they could swap in for each body part category. So for example, for legs, they had, a squat, a leg press, or a leg extension they could choose. And then they had like a low rep, moderate, and high rep day. So these experienced lifters basically got to choose what they wanted to do on the given day, what exercise they felt best matched up with the repetition target of that day. And over time, they found that they gained a little more muscle mass and that the strength on the measurements they used was a little higher. I don't think that's just because, autoregulation's magic. I think it's because it gave those lifters some choice and some autonomy. And if we look at the research on motivation and what allows people to be at their best, having a sense of competence and autonomy is very important. And I think any good coach should be trying to facilitate that. And I think part of it that we saw why that was beneficial is an artifact of that. It gave those lifters the ability to take a little more control and be excited about their training.
Might there not be a bias, though, Eric, on that selection? So an athlete may say, well, I just enjoy doing squats. I'm better at squats, so I'm always going to default to that one as opposed to the leg press or the leg extension.
Absolutely. And like, for example, if we're going to test gains in lean body mass, that's a whole body measure, right? We chuck in a DEXA scanner. And if one group is doing leg extension quite often and the other group is doing leg press and squats, then, leg extension isn't going to grow your glutes unless you're really doing a lot of Kegel exercises while you do it, which I do recommend. Just kidding. But so obviously, there's going to be some unequal comparisons, which is scientifically not valid, but probably still useful from a practical sense if you think about it. It's basically, this study showed us that experienced lifters, because that's who it was on, are smart, and they know that I'm not going to do leg extensions, 2 to 3 days a week. That's not as effective for growing. So I think it's a combination of, you can't have a perfect comparison across these movements. But we also have data where there are much better comparisons, which would suggest that choice is important. There's a researcher named Israel Halperin, and he had a study on, I think they're combat athletes, and they were punching an instrumented bag. So instrumented bag just means that it's able to measure the amount of force output that these guys are throwing. And they were given either a fixed order of the same punches or to choose how they wanted to throw that combo. And the group that got to choose how they wanted to throw the combo, they actually produced higher peak force values, throwing the same total number of punches and the same distribution, just a different order. So I think that probably indicates that there is some motivational factor there, that there is some subjective intuition that an experienced lifter has where he comes in and goes, my knee's feeling a little off. I don't want to do leg extension. Maybe I want to do, high foot position leg press. Now, with that said, I think the key to auto-regulated exercise selection is to narrow the choice enough so that the athlete can't do harm to themselves or can't degrade the quality of their progress. So, for example, I probably wouldn't put a leg extension or a leg press as an option. I would probably, hack squat, leg press, front squat variation, something like that. And you also have to think about the type of athlete you're working with. Like if I was working with a power lifter, I probably wouldn't give them huge amounts of flexibility on the big three. Like that's your sport, specificity hasn't gone away. Like if I set it up in such a way that you go 4 weeks without ever doing one of the competition lists, that's probably not useful in almost any block of training except like a post-annual cycle transition phase or something like that. For a bodybuilder, you get a lot more wiggle room. I would probably still want to see them completing their main compound lifts that we're using as a vehicle for hypertrophy. It's probably at least once per week because we want to maintain proficiency. They don't need to be experts in the big three, but whatever their, let's say, big six movements are, we want them to be proficient in them for sure so that we're not seeing neurological changes. We can go, right, you getting stronger in that 6 to 12 rep range is probably because we're making progress in and muscular size. So I think you can have more flexibility in isolation movements with bodybuilders. That's typically where I'd allow almost complete autonomy. Like, you know what, whatever bicep curl you want to do, that's fine. Because in the end, it's just elbow flexion, you know. For a powerlifter, I would probably relegate the auto-regulated exercise selection to assistance movements. So, you know, if you want to do a row of choice, lat pull down of choice, or maybe specific special movements, like, you know, you can do a close grip bench press, or you can do like a JM press or something like that. Give them some flexibility there where reasonable. I think that's where the sweet spot is for applying this concept.
Yeah, it's funny you say that, because I found the same thing just through practice. Is almost for all of my powerlifters now, it's almost exclusive. Like, okay, you can choose any horizontal row variation, or any vertical row variation, or any bicep curl variation, or any tricep extension variation, because it probably just doesn't matter what grip they do or what exercise, because even the magnitude of effect is going to be fairly minimal on like the week-to-week phase, and it only really matters as they gain more muscle. So that's something that I've found super useful. I know we do that with you quite a bit.
Yeah, I was going to say that I've seen that transition over the last couple of years in the training plans.
Yeah, I think the only time I haven't done it is if someone really loves to do barbell rows, but they have a ton of like squatting and deadlifting already in their plan, and we don't want to fatigue their back much. We might exclusively say, you know, do a machine variation, or do a seal row, or something like that. So on the same note of auto-regulating exercises and load, one thing we haven't talked about yet is auto-regulating volume. So how does auto-regulating volume differ from auto-regulating load by session to session, or exercises session to session? And are the tools any different?
Yeah, it's funny. You'll probably use some of the same tools, but you will use them differently. Like you guys talked about velocity-based training just in passing earlier. And that can be used in the same way that RPE is used. You know, you either have a velocity profile of the athlete, so you know what given relative loads should be at different velocities. You know, closer to 100% of 1RM, slower the velocity, and you can train in those kind of bands. That's the same thing as giving a target, you know, rep range in RPE. Likewise, you can use velocity to auto-regulate the number of sets you do. So, for example, you could say, right, I'm going to allow a certain amount of decay of velocity before we stop doing sets. So we'll do sets, and once you see a set that hits at least, let's say, 0.3 meters per second, no more. We're going to stop doing sets. And that on one day, you know, you get your second set in, and boom, you've already hit that velocity cutoff. You're done because you're fatiguing very quickly, or you're just not strong that day. On another day, you might be able to bang out 5-6 sets. So it's basically saying that how quickly you fatigue is an indicator for maybe how much volume you should do, which I think makes sense as a concept, because the whole reason we do volume is try to get an adaptation, but we have to think about a two-factor model of fitness and fatigue. There's really not a point of doing a ton of volume when you're already in the hole. We're just digging that hole deeper, and we're probably going to have to deload unplanned early or something like that. RPE can be used in the same way, and I did a study as part of my PhD where we just tried to validate the concept of what Mike T called fatigue percents, where you would take a top set and then drop a given percentage off that top set, and then keep doing back off sets until you got back to that initial set's RPE. A more simple way to describe it would be just an RPE cutoff point. Let's say you started at an RPE 7 for a set of 8, and you allowed yourself to climb, say, 2 RPE points. So you'd stay at that load until you hit like a 9. That's how I like to describe the concept to people first exposed to it, because I think having to drop a certain percentage off and then get back to that RPE tends to be a little confusing. So I like to use the concept of an RPE climb. So I start someone at kind of the bottom threshold of RPE that I think is appropriate for that day, have them use a fixed load, and then just keep going until they hit a certain RPE that I want to be the highest they go. And as you just like with velocity in that example I gave, that might be 3 sets one day or 6 sets another, based on how quickly you fatigue. And this is a newer concept. I don't think we have great data to say, and doing this is going to be better. But I think it makes sense conceptually. It does work in terms of producing different adaptations. There was a study done, I want to say out of Spain, where they had a 20% and a 40% velocity decay. So they would just keep doing reps until the initial reps velocity had dropped by 20% or 40%, and they saw different adaptations. In that group that dropped by 20%, they had a higher jump height. So obviously they're training faster all the time. They're more explosive. And the other group, we saw a little more hypertrophy overall because they did more volume. At least that's the hypothesis. So it does result in different things. And the systems in play do work in changing volume. And at least on that basic first principle, we think it makes sense to auto-regulate volume on a session-to-session basis based on how fatigued and how quickly you recover. But I'd really like to see in the future where we've actually done some research on like a fixed volume plan versus an auto-regulated one. Although it's a difficult design to kind of have those match up and be a fair comparison. Because like you said, sometimes an auto-regulatory plan is useful because it allows you to do more. And so if we manage to like fix the volumes against each other, but one just undulated more, it wouldn't be comparing, more volume to less volume. It'd be comparing the same volume, but just at different times, which might be better, but maybe auto-regulation is just better because it allows you to do more. So who knows?
I found that it's pretty challenging to auto-regulate volume in that manner because I've played around with volume decays with velocity. We call them like quality thresholds. We'll take 5%, 10%, whatever, and it seems like there's a bigger degree of variability between what I feel like I can do versus what I'm actually doing. Like, it also seems like there's varying degrees of, either you're training for strength or hypertrophy. Strength decays should probably be a little bit less, and hypertrophy probably a little bit more. And finding what those ideal ranges are proved to be very challenging for me. And I did that. I actually spent myself and Brady here, and a couple of our clients went through a little experiment where we actually auto-regulated 100% of everything besides exercise selection, and we saw decent results, but the training was fairly unpredictable, and that could very well be just the ranges we were using. But it does seem like the people that I've done or I've used volume auto-regulation with, it seems like they have to be very responsible lifters. Like you can't just sandbag a set with velocity because it's just going to be slow. It doesn't mean that you weren't prepared enough for it. You just didn't try. So it seems like effort's like the number one qualification for using velocity, at least in my experience. I know
that was about a year ago. You guys did that, wasn't it?
It was actually quite a while ago. Yeah. I'm super. I always want to revisit using like quality thresholds or like velocity decay, but I'm always like, I don't really want to sacrifice my own training to not make any progress. But
don't experiment on me.
Yeah, it's always super interesting. I think.
But you use a range for velocity too. What is that usually? What is the percentage difference? So from the profile,
I've kind of gone away. It's funny in my own programming. I've kind of gone away from being. I started out being ultra specific and wanting to control everything for everyone and finding these ideal training cycles and cycles within cycles and all leading up to this giant grandiose like thing, and it worked, but there's definitely lifters a lot of them are really smart and they can handle varying degrees of load, and a lot of people like choice. So I've kind of gone to the way of determining ranges for either reps in reserve or velocity, and they're usually about 3 to 5%. So I found that it was incredibly challenging to get lifters to hit like a velocity on the nose. Like if I say hit 0.3 meters per second, it's like, okay, I'll take 3 sets to do that, and then now what? So I've gone back from that to giving a broader range of like 5% load, and it seems to be super effective. And people can train to the higher percent or the lower speed if they're feeling pretty good, or they can train to the faster speed if they're not feeling as good. So we use ranges for almost everything now.
Except he takes my range and like backs it off even more because he knows I'm not going to listen. So he has the Duffin not listening factor factored in already. So
there's a little bit of gamesmanship.
That's the psychology part of it.
Well, it's like choosing 495 versus 500 for a set. Like, you're going to go up to
exactly.
So Eric, in the training process, how much of the training do you think should be auto-regulated versus predicted? It seems like we might be able to predict the first few weeks of a training block and then implement it. What have you found to be the ideal staging of auto-regulation?
I wish there was a single answer to that, but I think it very much depends on the lifter and your coaching style and involvement. So I'll give you the example of Bryce Lewis, who you guys have probably heard of, but I've been working with him.
He's a pretty decent lifter from what I understand.
he's getting up there, He'll get there one day.
Someday.
Yeah. But so I've been working with him longer than any other athlete I have worked with. I first started programming for him in 2010. So we have gone through many things over time, and I know him pretty well. So in this case, we have an experienced lifter at a high level who's familiar with the concept, who's a coach themselves, who I've been working with for the better part of my coaching career, from when they were a novice till now elite. In this case, what I typically do, because I know them well enough, is I can write a relatively long block of training. I think I've written 10 weeks of training and gone, here you go, Bryce. That said, there are, horizontal row of choice, things like that, vertical pull of choice. There are, on certain exercises, in certain cases, an RPE range, especially if it's something we don't have a known strength level on, or something that is just not as emotionally poignant of a lift, something that's not one of the big three, for example. But then for other things, I'm going to give fixed loads, and all of that happens on the background of knowing that if I get a text from Bryce anytime or a video on Facebook Messenger, we might scrap the plan or change things or move the deload up. So there's a kind of a blend of some of those elements we talked about in the first place, where I'm changing things on the fly based on how it looks, because this is one of the few athletes I have who can have me kind of on beck and call anytime. I'll respond to them. So there's a closer coaching relationship so that I can modify the template that we have. And I think there's nothing wrong with having a relatively fixed plan, so long as the athlete and the coach are under the impression that it is a guideline, right? So here's what happens if, you don't have a huge fight with your girlfriend, or if you don't get sick, or if, you don't have that weird twinge in your QL come back, or et cetera, et cetera, et cetera. Or if your random bouts of insomnia don't come back, or whatever. And also, like you said, on the other side of it, to allow them to also flourish, like if they're doing fantastic, to know that they can go for an extra 10 pounds on that lift if they're feeling really, really good. So that looks very different from when I have a person who comes to me for the first time. We've been working together for a couple months, and they're an experienced lifter. They've got a good head on their shoulders, but I don't have that kind of relationship with them. In that case, it might be like, right, we're going to do a fixed number of sets. I'll give you flexible off days, and I'm going to give you RPE ranges on the lifts that we're actually testing 1RM, but nothing else. And I'll write you a 4-week block. That to me is kind of the spread of differences that we might have. So it might be 3 months of training, 1 month of training, a few things auto-regulated, and then maybe the same amount of things auto-regulated, but the understanding that it can all be quite malleable at the other end of the spectrum.
With Bryce's training, how much have you guys done kind of working backwards from a goal versus using previous data from training cycles to schedule your training loads? And I've always find this super interesting. We had Chad Smith on here, and he was a huge proponent of working backwards from a goal and kind of going from there. I think there might be some differences in the types of athletes he works with, and they might have a little bit more freedoms in that sense, but in regards to what you've done with Bryce, how much do you work backwards versus kind of use what you already know to design the training loads?
Yeah, there's a fair bit of that. Some of it's just logistical. Like, for example, I know every year that Bryce if he competes, is going to do 2 or 3 meets, right? He's going to do nationals and worlds, and he might do Arnold's. That's basically it, right? And if there is some kind of little exhibition or something else on the side, we go, right, we're not going to peak for that. Go in there, shake everybody's hands, hit a big bench or hit a big deadlift, and let's get out of there, because we got some big goals for the year. So the training cycles themselves are planned based on a specific competition. The average strength athlete who works with me, sometimes they come up and go, right, let's just start with a 12-week, quote unquote off-season cycle, and then I'll figure out what local meet I want to do within a 20-mile surrounding area of my house. And that's kind of going to be someone's experience, unless they're an absolute genetic phenom, for the first handful of years they're competing until they qualify for nationals, and then everything gets structured around USAPL nationals or whatever their equivalent is in their organization. So some of it's just purely logistical. With Bryce, I am always working back from competition in terms of planning the number of weeks and looking at how long did it take him to recover after the previous year. For example, after we've finished nationals in October, we're normally pretty wrecked, and not just physically, but a huge part of that's just psychological burnout. Bryce likes a fair amount of variation. He's a really interesting, cool, quirky dude, and just doing the big three all the time or primarily is mentally fatiguing for him. Not all lifters are like that. So I might go, right, let's get some, play some pickup volleyball games. We're going to take a week off training, come back to it. We'll throw some bodybuilding in there. We're just going to hit the big three once per week. And we know that we're going to lose a finite amount of strength over a little bit of time, and then we're going to get back into building up. But that might be fuzzy by two weeks or so. So that could change the length of that first kind of preparatory block in the next year. So it might be 6 weeks, it might be 12 weeks, depending on kind of how that recovery went, how he's feeling, whether any nagging injuries, et cetera. And then that will then subsequently shift the length of each block for each competition prep. Outside of that, we also are in a unique position where we are looking at other people's performance, which doesn't really go in line with kind of my 3D muscle journey philosophy, which is, just you do you, always improve yourself. But when you're in a position where you are, I think there was one nationals where any one of 5 people could have won the 105s. We had previous returning champs, previous world record holders, all in the same flight. We had Eli Burke, we had Garrett Blevins, we had Bryce Lewis, and a lot of people were all competing at the same time. And honestly, one person slips up and everything changes. So we have to be aware of where do we need to be on these lists in order to secure a spot. We're fortunate with Bryce that he's a big puller. So except when he's going against the Polish phenom, Mr. Deadlift himself. Yeah. So when we're going to, we can't rely on the deadlift against Krzysztof Werbicki. But in the United States, he tends to be one of the biggest pullers. So if we can get out front enough with the squat or hold on enough on the squat and the bench, then we can make the right decision on deadlift. And a huge credit goes to Matt, Gary, and Susie, who also help him with competition day platform coaching. So some of that is all based around how other people are performing, and then working back from, like you said, what do we think are realistic improvements and PRs to be made in that time? We're not going to see huge jumps. I don't get surprised with Bryce very often, like, oh wow, you squatted 750. I didn't think that was going to happen. Like, that happens occasionally. Like if a lifter goes away for a year, comes back, or you stumble upon a new training block, or they finally get their sleep sorted out, and an intermediate goes from like a 450 squat to a 500 squat in 12 weeks. It's not normal, but it happens, So that type of thing can happen, and I think that's why it's better to be a little more open-ended with intermediates. But when you're dealing with a very high-level lifter, I was really happy at the Arnold because, Bryce benched 222.5, and at Worlds we benched 220, or Nationals, I should say. So like 2.5 kg improvement competition to competition, that's awesome. And I think that allows you to go, right, let's see if we can put 7.5 kgs on the deadlift. We'll make an aggressive push this year on the deadlift. So yeah, you can definitely work backwards when you're working with a high enough level athlete, because the changes you're dealing with are much smaller in nature, and you should have your finger on the pulse of what the constraints of what you can do with them are, without risking, experiment with Bryce and now he's not going to qualify for Worlds. There's a large cost to that. So I think you're working in a smaller range of options for programming, and you're working with some smaller magnitude of changes that are possible. So indeed, I think you can work backwards from a goal for sure.
And better lifters just kind of get it too. If they have a 5x5 at X load, they're not going to miss 4 reps on the second set and try and keep going because maybe they'll get it on the next set, and that seems like one of the biggest differences too between like lifter qualifications. Even like it seems like training age is the biggest. It seems like training age and how much strength someone's gained over their career are like the biggest factors of like how responsible they are. I've found anyway. But even then, I think all lifters have a little bit of their biases. Like I know Duffin has some specific biases, whereas other people like they'll be ultra conservative when they don't need to be, and so yeah.
Absolutely. And some people are just not suited towards autoregulation.
Yeah.
You know, like I don't use a ton of RPE based training with Bryce. He's probably on the low end of the amount of that. And I know for him, it gets in his head a little too much. It's not worth the emotional stress. And it forces him to get a little bit out of just kind of feeling the training session and hitting the targets and kind of being just a soldier of an athlete. And forces him to get into thinking, which makes him question himself and then kind of erodes his confidence. So you have to be aware of the personality of the athlete. And this is something that I think is not surprising. A huge focus of Mike T these days is assessing kind of the emotional states and personality characteristics of lifters. And he's very interested in when and how can autoregulation be used as a tool in different lifters. And I think that is really the future. Instead of looking at hey, RPE is better than percentage 1RM. It's like, maybe on average, if we take like this big picture, just because it gets you closer to your load, but there are definitely people who are going to do worse on an RPE-based training program than percentage 1RM, and I think that needs to be acknowledged and then figured out why is that.
I think there's definitely a tie between personality traits and the type of coaching methodology that you use with lifters, and that's something Brandon and I have been talking about a lot is like, how do we look at that on an incoming assessment basis so that we don't have to learn that over that first, 12-week block or whatever it is as you're learning the athlete? If we can figure out an assessment to, get that started down the right path.
Determine how they're going to respond to motivation,
Well, yeah, it seems like some training variables are better set based on just how well received they are from the athlete versus physiologically, can they recover? Are they performing? Like I've had a few really high-level athletes that have been crushing things like improving week after week, month after month, but it just like becomes so emotionally challenging to them that, okay, we now have to back it off and go into like 14-day microcycles instead of 7 days and kind of spread stuff out a little bit more. And it's just because, maybe they have more life stress going on or what have you, but it seems like the emotional capacity is almost the thing that limits a lot of people. But certainly like a well-structured training plan is going to account for, what they can tolerate volume-wise, but I think there's that intangible that's kind of always present.
Yeah. I think we focus so much on the physiology of things, and we don't look at, we want to know the body type, we want to know how people respond, but we never look at the psychology of things as much, Yeah,
that would be a big oversight for sure.
Absolutely. I think I completely agree that I think an effective coach can be just baseline proficient in understanding, physiology, but if they're highly attentive to the logistics and the behavior and the psychology of an athlete, they're going to be incredibly effective. Like even if let's say that autoregulation might have some tangible impact on matching up your physiology with the stress level of training. I think in the real world where people have a job and they lift, and they have kids and they lift, and like the sleep levels, the stress levels in their life, all that is doing this in the background. I think that's going to be the primary area that autoregulation is helpful. John Kiley, I don't know if you guys have heard of him, but he's a periodization theorist, and he has written some really influential topics in the arena that have kind of changed the conversation a little bit, where traditionally periodization conversations are all about people and their adherents arguing with each other about what's the best setup. And he kind of said, look, if you are in an emotionally stressed state, it can take 3 times as long to heal a wound compared to if you're not. That's a 300% difference just because you're unhappy. So do we need to be discussing whether block periodization is better than undulating? Maybe we need to have some system to account for that. And I think he's 100% on the money. And I think in some way I've seen autoregulation as a tool to address that. And that's another big misconception, to go back way to your first question, is that autoregulation in and of itself is a type of training rather than something that which it actually is you fit it into a plan as a way to add those elements of calling an audible, if you will, so that someone can adapt to those changes in life circumstance, logistics, psychology, mood, all that stuff.
It's nothing more than a tool. It is not a all-encompassing method. Without
Absolutely.
Yeah.
I like the analogy of calling an audible because, first of all, I'm a football coach, but but also you call an audible to either take advantage of an opportunity that exists in the defense or to move away from a play that is going to turn out bad because of what's there. So, yeah, I like that analogy as it relates to our training.
Yeah. Eric,
Absolutely.
We're about running up on time, but I've got one more question for you that I've been wanting to ask the whole time. But with all of the systems you use, with all of the different types of autoregulation tools, and with all of the different lifters you've worked with, what do you feel like is the best way to gauge improvements in strength with your athletes? Is it that they've simply improved their strength in each competition moving forward? Are you looking at estimated 1-rep maxes on a weekly or monthly basis? Are you looking at the load increases versus the perceived difficulty of those loads? In your opinion, what's kind of your go-to for establishing whether or not this lifter is or is not making progress?
That's a really good question, and it's the key to everything as far as making changes to training in the future. I'm going to give you as short of an answer as I can because it's a different answer for different sports and different levels of athlete. For a power lifter at a relatively entry level, so novice or intermediate, I think you're going to see changes in training that are indicative of them just getting stronger. You can set up a training program that is linear in progress and still submaximal RPE, and they're going to be hitting PRs at submaximal RPEs in training. And you don't really need to do much. You just need to make sure they're recovered and training appropriately and have a good setup, and you're going to see them progressing. As you get to a higher level in powerlifting, or strength sport in general, I think the question changes based on how close you are to competition. If I've got an athlete and we're writing down on the attempt cards like what we're going to try that day, unless they had an absolutely amazing training block, I'm probably going to base it on a reasonable PR from the last competition because training and competition aren't the same. Unless you have a huge history with an athlete, they always either over or underperform in competition, then you can have a different relationship with training. But for the most part, I like to use previous competition performances to dictate the next competition. And then how much of a PR we think is in store for that third attempt is going to be based on how well did that last training block go. But then in the off season, when you're, let's say, more than 3 months away from a competition, I think using an estimated 1RM from a RPE rep load combination is a really useful way to just kind of assess, are we on track? And not that it should just be linearly going up, but in phases of high volume, is it maintaining or only slightly depressed? And in phases where we are going into lower volume, high intensity, is it then rising? And is it a net gain over time when we're looking at the big picture? That said, I do think there might be times for a lifter where just straight up AMRAP or 1RM testing should occur. I think in a power lifter who's competing maybe once or twice a year, you could probably throw in 1 to 2 cycles where you do end in a 1RM test, or maybe say an AMRAP at 90% of their previous 1RM and stop at like a 9 RPE, just so you can get a decent gauge of how strong they are. And then if I was to flip it to bodybuilders, I think at the higher levels, semi-consistent, maybe say every 8 to 12 weeks, AMRAPs to a high RPE is a very useful thing to do. The ability to perform new, say, 6 to 12 RMs or even 5 to 8 RMs, because I think that's typically a little more reliable in bodybuilders, is the best guess you can have at whether or not the training is working, and they are getting bigger. Because watching, at least at the lifters I work with who are drug-free and tend to be relatively advanced, you might be seeing an increase in stage weight of 1 pound over 3 years. So getting the measurement tape or stepping on the scale is not going to tell you what you need to know. You kind of have to look for those small changes.
That's great.
Excellent.
Yeah, good stuff.
So, Eric, where can people find you at?
Yes, so I would probably, the hub for finding stuff about me and my philosophies and our group's training methods would be 3dmusclejourney.com. And then from there, depending on how nerdy you are and what your focus is, there's kind of shifts and pivots in directions you can take. So there's MASS, the monthly research review I do with Greg Knuckles and Mike Zerdos. If you really want to kind of dive into the peer-reviewed research and our take on that, and that's a monthly subscription. If you want to watch just our takes on bodybuilding and powerlifting, you can go on our YouTube channel, read our blog, or you can check out my Instagram at Helms3DMJ. And if you want to dive in and read something, I've got the Muscle and Strength Pyramids, which are my nutrition and training books. And if you really want to get nerdy, you can go to my ResearchGate profile and read actual peer-reviewed research. But, I wouldn't recommend that for most people. So,
Okay.
Well, Eric, I want to thank you so much for taking the time to chat with us today, and I'll definitely second our listeners checking out the mass subscription. We're subscribed to it, and all of our coaches are looking at it fairly frequently. So, fantastic resource, and it's actually not too dry that the average person, I don't think, could pick it up. I think it's a really it's something that really bridges, I think, the really dry, in-depth research versus how can we actually apply this to everyday life. So definitely give that a plug. And then
thank you.
For all of our listeners, check out kabukishank.com for all your coaching and movement needs.
All right.
Good one, Brandon.
Thank you for having me, guys. Huge honor.
Thanks, Eric.
Thank you so much, Eric.
My pleasure.
All right.
That's a wrap.
Cool. Thanks, guys.
That was fun.
Oh, thank you. That was
fun.
a good podcast. Really enjoyed it. So
good. Sweet.
That's about as in depth as we've gotten for a full hour on autoregulation. That was really
definitely
good. We appreciate your input there.
Yeah.
Absolutely. I'm happy to dive deep on something that I can't stop nerding out about. So no worries.
Yeah. Right.
So how long till this one pops up?
Probably.
We'll publish it. May go today, but usually we publish the following Monday. No. What?
We got about a 3-week backlog right now.
Oh, they do. Okay, so it'll
be about 3 weeks. Yeah.
Cool. No worries. Yeah. Let me know when it's up. I'll definitely share it on all my platforms.
All right. Yeah, we'll tag you and throw it across our social media. Make sure you can see it and repost. So it would be appreciated.
Perfect.
So
yeah.
Awesome.
No problem.
All right.
Great, Eric.
All right,
Thank
guys.
you.
Good to meet you all.
Bye-bye. Nice to meet you.